Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is one of the most vexing problems in the history of religion and philosophy, I suppose, the existence of God. My guest is Dr. Jim Driscoll. He is a specialist in Renaissance literature and is one of the foremost literary critics focusing in on Jungian criticisms of Renaissance literature. He is the author of Identity in Shakespearean Drama, The Unfolding God of Jung and Milton, and Shakespeare and Jung, the God in Time. This is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to that video. Welcome, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Thank you, Jeffrey. It's good to be here.
We're going to talk about a very interesting question, one that has puzzled philosophers and college sophomores in particular, I think, for many generations, the existence of God. And it strikes me that one of the real difficulties of addressing the question is defining the nature of God in the first place.
That's correct. That's a very difficult question. And in my book, The God of Time, I've dealt with it and seen five different levels of meaning. The first one is simply the God image within the self. And Jung maintained that every human being has a God image in the self, and that's basically the start of how people get into thinking about God and so on. And that God image is really the self, which is a homeostatic, regulating force within the psyche. And according to Jung and the Hermeticists and various traditions, the microcosm, which is the self, mirrors the macrocosm. And there's a structuring, regulating force for the universe itself that is parallel to the self in regulating the psyche. So that's the basic first level. And then you go to a second level, which is has to do with the social conceptions of deity. People start talking with each other and trying to figure things out, and they develop religions which explain their spiritual and psychic intuitions and perceptions. And these tend to be tribal initially and rather simple in isolated tribes, but in civilizations they grow into something very complex. And that becomes a civilizational godhead. And it's basically a Judeo-Christian godhead in the West, where you start out with the primitive parent figure, and then you move into a kind of hostile brothers archetype, where you have Satan and versus essentially Christ, and then at the top you have the Holy Spirit. That, of course, is the Christian view. The Jewish does not elaborate in that direction. Islam claims to have the same God, but a more accurate perception of it, and the Islamic Godhead is unitary. It's not a quaternity or a trinity as in the Christian case. It's simply one deity. But in the Islamic case, the deity reflects not the self so much as it does the ego. Of course, Islamic scholars would disagree with that. And in the Christian case, according to Jung, you have the same thing. You have ego, but going through a kind of individuation process in history. But then you have another conception of God, which appears in Greek mythology, in the East, in Taoism, for example, and that's identified with nature, or Gaia is the current modern conception of it, promulgated by James Lovelock, and it's the idea that there's a homeostatic regulating mechanism for nature itself, and that's identified with Gaia. So that's kind of a god of life on Earth. Whereas we were talking previously about God, a civilizational Godhead, being the regulating values and ideas and so on of a particular civilization. Now, none of these things are the same as actual God, and that's a term that Jung uses. Not very much. I think it's a very interesting and important term, because the question is whether there is an actual God, and I think that the answer to that is yes, for several reasons. For one thing, the universe is ordered; it's not chaos, and so actual God is, in fact, the ordering laws or forces of the universe, the chief of which, in my view, is time. But also, actual God is something that would prevail anywhere in the universe at any time. And we have to consider that the universe is incredibly vast. On my book, The God in Time, I have this picture of a galaxy on the front. This galaxy is 9.6 billion years from the Milky Way, and it is a particularly gigantic galaxy. It was evidently thought to be the largest galaxy discovered at the time in which it was discovered. But 9.6 billion is just an unbelievable distance when you consider that the closest galaxy to us is 1.3 million light years from us. But actual God has to, as a meaningful concept, has to be applied as a governing force in this galaxy just as much as it does in here in the Milky Way and anywhere in the universe. And I find it difficult when I consider that it has to apply throughout this vast universe of, we have evidently, it's estimated 3 trillion galaxies the size of the Milky Way, and the Milky Way has approximately 100 billion stars, of which ours is average. Well, actual God has to apply to everywhere and in the entire universe. And so I identify it with the force of time, but it's also a kind of a context for the human conceptions of God. It's not really an alternative to them, but it's not so far apart, so far away, and so distant as that it is unimportant to us. In fact, the mystics try to reach this God more than the God of the various religions. My belief is that when people have genuine mystical experiences, are having some sort of communication with this God, not with the God of any civilization or any tribe. So you have these various levels of God, and it's my belief that actual God, that we can definitely say that actual God exists simply because there's order, and that comes from the fact that we have time, and energy, and they follow certain orderly patterns. There's also meaning and value in the universe. And when people think of God, they wonder, is life meaningless? Is everything meaningless, or is it meaningful? Well, actual God, by giving order to things, and one of the ways it gives order through time is through the irreversibility of time. That makes each event unique, and it also allows for creativity, since creativity requires uniqueness, or the ability to produce uniqueness. So all of these are things that can be seen in actual God. Now, one of the problems with our conceptions of God, I think, is that in the West, we talk about worshiping God. God is something to be worshipped. Or in Islam, it's submission. You submit. You obey. My own personal thought is that a God who is worthy of submission and obedience wouldn't want that from us. And a God who is worthy of worship wouldn't be interested in that. But I think if we can attribute intentions to this deity in an anthropomorphic way, we would say that what God wants is communication, understanding, maybe above all, listening. Learning to listen to God. Rather than learning to worship Him or learning to obey Him. We learn to listen, which you do that by getting in touch with the self. You also get in touch with time, the way Jung tried to do with synchronicities, and even the astrologers try to do that. It's a very different approach, and it's trying to get in touch with God as a self, as yourself trying to get in touch with the self of the universe, rather than your ego trying to get in touch with some other ego, which is basically shaped like in the West, like some sort of desert sheik or tribal deity, or in many primitive civilizations, it's God is envisaged as an animal. In Bern, Switzerland, they used to worship bears 3,000 years ago. In Siberia, they worship the Siberian tiger as God, and so on. But it's not. It's self to self. But I'm going on. You probably have other questions.
Well, it seemed as if you were equating actual God with the Jungian self in some way.
I think the Jungian self is the reflection of actual God, or it is the presence of actual God within the human psyche.
Well, that's pretty clear. In other words, in effect, you're saying God exists because we exist.
Well, that's essentially what Jung said. He said, well, I don't believe in God. I know God exists because I experience Him directly in experiencing the self. So that's I think my view as well. God is not something that you prove that exists, like you prove that there is like an additional moon to Saturn, for example.
Well, when I say when I refer to the human being, what I'm really suggesting is we are conscious. We are each of us, you could say, a point of awareness. A self isn't just an object. A self is a subject.
Yes, that's true. And one might say that God is the subject of the universe.
Yeah. Or perhaps the subject of the universe is a demigod and that the actual God is still even more transcendent. I don't know.
In my view, actual God is identified with time. Now, that doesn't mean that it's exactly the same as time, and there is nothing more to God than time. There may be more, but time is an essential attribute and manifestation of actual God.
Well, time is very paradoxical because we're always only ever in the now moment. We never experience directly anything but the now moment. The future and the past are somehow elusive.
Yes. We're always on the edge, looking forward, looking to things that don't yet exist and back to things that no longer exist. We're simply a knife's edge of consciousness that moves forward with time.
I mean, if you say that God is time, isn't that very similar to saying that God is the now moment? Which is, I think, something that one might hear from a spiritual teacher like Eckhart Tolle.
God is the now moment, but God is more than the now moment, because time is structured. It has patterns, and it's been someplace, it's going someplace. Now, you might say that the now moment is how we experience time, but we also reflect, always in the now moment, of course, but we reflect upon the past, we anticipate the future. So much of, well, it might even be said that all of what our thinking and consciousness is either reflecting on the past or anticipating the future, because we're not really thinking anything. If we're just in the now moment, our minds are sort of blankly receiving whatever perceptions are coming in, either internally into the psyche or through our eyes and senses.
Well, it strikes me, if we come back to this notion of subjectivity and being the subject, is, to my knowledge, there's really nothing that you can find in physical science that explains subjectivity at all. The fact that we each have subjective awareness seems to completely elude physical science, which suggests to me that it partakes of our spiritual nature. One might even say the divinity within us allows us to have subjective experiences.
It's a precondition. Subjectivity is a precondition for having science, art, any of these other things. So it seems not sensible to be looking for subjectivity as if it were a thing among things, because it's a precondition for all things.
Wouldn't that be a pretty good definition of God? A precondition for all things?
Well, that would be one definition of God. Yes. But I think that a lot of people, when they wonder whether God exists, they're wondering, is there any meaning to life? Is there any value? Or is it all pointless? And it may be pointless in terms of our mythologies, in that they're not true. The earth was not created 6,000 years ago. It's not going to end with Jesus or some Messiah or some other figure coming down and changing everything. It's not, the meaning of our life is not something that we can find in any of the belief systems that we've developed. However, it is something that we can find. I remember a story, I think you might have told me, it was Krishna Murta, and a woman came to him and asked him and said, I look for God everywhere and cannot find him. What do I do? And he asked her, is there anything that makes you happy or delights you? And she said, yes, my nephew gives me great delight. And he said, that is how God speaks to you, or that is manifests himself or itself to you. And it need not be another person. It could be an activity that you particularly enjoy, a moment, and it can be negative things too. Time is irreversible, and that means every event is unique. Everything in the universe is unique, and uniqueness and duration and creativity are three of the ways in which we measure value, maybe the three most important ways in which we measure value. So all of those things are indisputable. Now you can theorize anything you want, and so you can dispute them that way, but just imagining something so is not going to create something with which you can deal, something that is in any sense existential. It's just a fantasy. And what we deal with is, in our lives, is unique irreversibility. These also imply responsibility and a kind of freedom. We create who we are because everything is unique and everything is irreversible. So it's all meaningful, but it's not necessarily going to be meaningful in the way people want, or it may not be meaningful in a way that makes them happy. But if it doesn't make them happy, they have to find a way to have value and meaning that does make them happy. And that's almost always possible, unless, even if you have only a moment left to reflect before your death, there are ways of finding meaning and value in that moment.
I suppose there's the interesting story of a man being chased by a tiger over a cliff, and he jumps over the cliff to avoid the tiger, and he finds himself on a little ledge. And the tiger is up above him, and down below are rocks, so he has no opportunity. But he notices on the cliff where he's stuck some strawberries growing. So he says to himself, I might as well enjoy a good strawberry. So we can find meaning simply in physical pleasure.
Yeah, we find meaning in all sorts of circumstances where we're not looking for it. And sometimes by looking diligently, we just make ourselves neurotic and fixated and plunge into something that seems meaningless to us.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your description, you make much of the fact that time is irreversible. And I suppose from our conventional lived experience, time is irreversible. There's the Benjamin Button movie where he is born old and then grows younger and younger and ends his life as an infant. But that never happens. And in real life. However, physicists tell us that at the quantum level, time is perfectly reversible, that there's nothing at the quantum level that suggests that time only moves in one direction.
But we don't exist at the quantum level. And there's no evidence that things above the quantum level, the level of bodies and even molecules and atoms, reverse time. And not all physicists agree with that view. I'm not, physics isn't something that I spend a great deal of time with, so I'm not aware of what the consensus is. The idea that time is irreversible is something that is usually attributed to St. Augustine. Now, that doesn't mean that he was the very first to think of it, but perhaps he was the first to think deeply about it. And it's one of the reasons why we think this idea, his thoughts on time, are one of the reasons why we think of Augustine as more than just a saint and a theologian, but as a profound philosophical thinker. And the idea of the reversibility of time is different from, it's novel for him in the sense that the Hellenic culture in which he grew up, which by that time had moved from Platonism into Neoplatonism, but it tended to look at time as circular, just going around and around and around for eternity. And he said, no, it has a beginning and not exactly, well, yes, an end, because everything is absorbed back into God. I believe that's the way he would look at it. And everything in between is unique and irreversible. So rather than having things that are just repeated over and over again, rather than time being unreal, as it is, I suppose, in the Greek circular views, or in some views of modern physicists, they say, well, time is just set from beginning to end, and the idea that there is time is unreal. It's just kind of a block universe. But St. Augustine says, no, not so. Time is real. Events are irreversible. Therefore, we're responsible for what we are. Our lives are our creation, and we are creative, just like God. So, St. Augustine is a very profound and important thinker. Most of modern existentialism, which is a very varied movement, stems from St. Augustine. I believe that, for example, Jung and Whitehead are essentially in St. Augustine's tradition, but the other views are out there. Another modern figure of tremendous influence is Nietzsche, and he plays with the idea of eternal recurrence, which jumps back from St. Augustine back to the Greeks. And of course, the Hindu view of time is not St. Augustine's. It's like the Greeks. This was almost, I would gather, a kind of a fundamental idea that goes back to the basics of Indo-European civilizations, and might be built into the language or the earliest stages of that culture. And yet, Augustine moved things in a different direction. And he moved things in a different direction out of his interpretation of Christianity and the Christian God. Now, you understand the Jewish tradition more than I do. Where does it stand on these issues?
Well, I would say this, Jim. In the Jewish tradition, it's pretty clear that God is outside of time because God creates time. God separates the day from the night, and by creating day and night, God creates time. But God existed when there was nothing but chaos, nothing but a void. God was still there. And it says in the early parts of the Jewish Torah something to the effect that God hovered over the face of the void. Suggesting a timeless state. But let me ask you this question. I don't know where it comes from, but I've certainly heard this in the Christian tradition. You probably know that Jesus is said to be the Alpha and the Omega, which I think is a way of suggesting that Jesus is time, the beginning and the end of time.
Probably so. And isn't that Teilhard de Chardin's view?
Well, I think you find it in Teilhard as well, yes.
Yeah. Well, what you just said about the Jewish view is not inconsistent with Augustine's view, that he sees, a beginning and an end, and time is something in between. Now, I ask myself, what do I think? And I suppose I think that there would be nothing before and nothing after, because time, it's, in order to think, to be conscious of anything, there has to be time. And it doesn't make sense to talk about a time when there was no time, because that would be a time when there was no consciousness and nothing could think or reflect on anything that was happening. But another point, too, is time is related to change. And time just measures change. And if you have change, you've got time. So if you had chaos before the creation of the ordered world that we live in, you'd still have change. Chaos is uncontrolled, disordered change, but it's not a nothingness. The only thing where you could have no change is nothingness. But the nothingness would be, couldn't include having a God. And even if God were only a thought process, there would be change. There are changes in your thoughts all the time. You just, watch the stream of your consciousness, and it's full of change. Read James Joyce in his Stream of Consciousness novel, for example. I think it's impossible to think about a time with no time.
That's a good point.
For that reason, I would say it's impossible to think about a time with no God either.
Well, of course, we can approach God in other ways besides logic, and I think that's what Scripture tends to do. The phrase God hovered over the face of the void isn't really easily subjected to logical analysis. And I think pretty much theologians would agree that God defies our logic. Yes,
and I think probably, if forced to think about it, that they wouldn't say that that the God hovering over the void and the primeval chaos was a time without time. They would say that God initiated in the act of creation a time that was ordered and meaningful, and where it was possible for conscious beings such as ourselves to exist.
Well, you seem to be suggesting, though, that we can't really address the question of actual God. Does actual God exist if we can't define actual God in some way that at least can be subjected to a logical analysis? And that may be the problem right there.
Well, I guess I would say that actual God exists because time, consciousness, and order exist. And I would define actual God is that process that force, that energy, which makes possible time, order, value, and meaning.
Let me come back to the question, if I may, Jim, of actual God, because I think there are certainly philosophers, and I suspect the existentialists amongst them, who would say, I understand what you're saying about actual God, but I think it's possible that we can have a meaningful life even if actual God does not exist. And that your argument that because the universe appears to be vast and orderly, that therefore actual God must exist, a lot of philosophers don't accept that argument.
Well, I would agree that we don't have to believe in actual God in order to have a meaningful life. For someone who recently died, Stephen Hawking, he seems to have had a meaningful life. But he was an atheist. He didn't believe in actual God, and he actually believed what, to me, is the absurd idea that the universe could just suddenly end tomorrow. Mm-hmm. You don't need to be connected with actual God at a level of consciousness, ideology, and so on in order to have meaningful experiences.
You pointed out earlier that a God worthy of being worshipped wouldn't want to be worshipped.
It strikes me as a very important point. And a God that worthy of submission would not want submission. But I think God wants us to listen to it, him, she. There's no way of putting a sex-related pronoun on actual God. And the spiritual forces within the psyche will make themselves manifest. I think that was Wittgenstein's phrase. I can't remember the whole thing, but he talks about the unknown, the mystical making itself manifest. And these spiritual impulses make themselves manifest to people in different degrees. Now, maybe it never made itself manifest to Stephen Hawking, but I suspect it actually did. What I think happens is that it's transmuted into something else. And we live in a very ideological age. And I think sometimes people don't want to pursue, or the ego is not willing to pursue the spiritual impulses. And so they become transmuted into a kind of ideological into ideology. Instead of having religion or spirituality, they have ideology. And it's so often the case that people who say they're atheist will be very ideological. And of course, Marxism is officially atheistic, and yet it is extremely ideological. That's another interesting subject. Marxism, I think of Marxism and Islam as being ideological offshoots from the essential thrust of the Judeo-Christian deity and civilization. Marxism has become, at least in the West, the most important challenge to the traditional religion and so on, but it's a subject that is not really that much explored, the relationship between Marxism and religion. Ideology and religion are both ways of denying genuine spirituality, in my view.
There was some suggestion that the early Marx, who was something of a poet and a mystic, actually, not at all an atheist.
That's interesting. I don't know whether I've never really read a biography of Marx, and Marxism is somewhat different from Marx. I don't think that the best way to understand Marxism is necessarily to read Marx.
The same distinction between Christ and Christianity. They're not the same either.
Right. The two big litmus test issues now, as I was saying, abortion and homosexuality, are things that were never discussed by Jesus in the four Gospels.
Well, getting back to the existence of God, you're essentially saying that because the universe is orderly, the universe is meaningful, and because time provides that meaning, that God exists, and God is therefore very closely associated with time.
Yes. And those who want to be or feel impelled, who feel an inner drive for a closeness with God, they need to deal with time. Mm-hmm. Actually, not necessarily time as a philosophical subject, but they need to learn to intuitively watch the cues that time gives in terms of synchronicity and a lot of other things. But another way of listening is through dreams, fantasies. It's listening is a very difficult thing that each person must learn on their own, because they're going to have their own way of doing it. And if they follow someone else's formula, they're going to miss the communications that are. They're going to miss some of the communications that are most essential to them to understand their lives and to determine who they are.
I would say that God is maybe even a little more basic than time itself. The very fact that we can listen is an indication of the divine spark within us.
Yeah, well, it's an indication of consciousness, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think consciousness itself is that divine spark within us.
Yeah, I think that that's so, and consciousness makes it possible for us to understand time and to understand our position on the knife's edge.
Well, James P. Driscoll, this has been a fascinating discussion, and I certainly want to encourage our viewers who want to go into more depth on this to take a look at your book, Shakespeare and Jung, The God in Time.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey.
Well, thank you very much for being with me, Jim.